Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis. I'm here once again with Gunnar Amelunk. Gunnar, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm also a little sad because we got to make this one count since you're going away next week. It's going to be our last one for about a week and a half-ish. So, like I said, we got to make this one count.
Yep, yep. We got big shoes to fill with missing an entire week, one whole week without us. I can't believe the listeners are going to survive, but we'll make it happen. I am, yeah, like you said. I mean, I'm on my way to Florida for our spring trip this upcoming week, so I'm excited to do that. Getting a little bit warmer weather, not too warm. If it's too warm, I don't like it. I'm very picky with my weather, but no, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping we get some wins down there and then come back up here, and Brewers will almost be started at that point. But
Mhm.
for those of you listening, and if you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do so on whatever platform you are listening on and to rate us 5 stars. Follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod to stay up to date on these episode releases. And then, like I hinted at there a second ago, today is going to be a Brewers focused episode. So, Gunnar, what do we got coming up?
Today we'll be talking about are the Brewers in the market for another starter potentially? And we'll also jump into um, sort of a discussion that we've talked about amongst ourselves, but now we're going to sort of tie it in as the big topic here is spring training stats and how much we value those in general. Then next, we're kind of titling this one the Freshman, the sequel, because we think that there's not going to be another group coming up here that we're pretty excited about. So we're going to jump into those guys and talk all about them. Then we got a new sort of showcase games that the MLB has presented us. I kind of forgot about it to be honest, but sort of a prospect showing type of thing, and they call it the spring breakout game. So we'll just talk about our thoughts on that, and then other just spring training updates and little tidbits that we've got as well. So jumping into that first main topic, Spencer, that I was talking about, which involves us acquiring maybe a new starter or another starter, um, most likely via the free agent market. And the first report that we got was from Robert Murray. He said that the Brewers might be in the market for a mid-tier starter, threw out names like Michael Lorenzen and Mike Clevenger. I guess we can jump into our maybe first question here from Tanner DeGrave. Um, he says, I'd like your thoughts on what we can expect behind Peralta. Wade's health is obviously up in the air. Can't really be banking on Rays to become the number two, can we? But first, I guess we can kind of rewind, and then we'll jump into that one after. Spencer, do you think that we need maybe just another starter, mid-tier starter like Robert kind of laid out there?
I think, I, I don't know if need is the word I would use, but I think it would be helpful. I don't think they absolutely have to add somebody in that realm for them to compete, but I do think that the starter depth is iffy. I shouldn't say the depth is iffy. The top of the rotation and the middle of the rotation is a little iffy, and you're banking on at least a few of the depth pieces being good enough to handle that type of, I guess, role, that load in the middle of the rotation. So I don't hate the idea of Lorenzen. I'm not a big Clevenger fan, not on or off the field recently, so I'm probably okay passing on Clevenger. Lorenzen, I would take Lorenzen, but I have a feeling the cost is going to be beyond what I would think he's worth. So, and it sounds like he wants a 2-year deal, which is not what I would be interested in on the Brewer side of things. If he's there for a 1-year deal at like 5-6 million, absolutely. I would go out and I would add Lorenzen to this mix and maybe push one of the younger guys back to AAA for a year or not maybe for a year, but at least to start the season. And I think he'd be helpful, but I don't think he's going to be worth what he's asking. And I don't think Clevenger is better than what the Brewers are currently carrying on their roster. But regarding Tanner's question we had there, we should note that Pat Murphy talked about Wade Miley a little bit this week. He Miley threw a bullpen this morning, or it might have been yesterday. And Murph said that he wouldn't count Miley out for that first week of the season. So it sounds like he's progressing better. It also sounds like Wade is pushing pretty hard to try and be able to start the season off of the IL. And I think the Brewers are probably going to lean more towards being safe if they have to. But if he's feeling good, if everything's checking out fine, I'd imagine right now it looks like he's on pace to potentially start the season healthy. So regardless of if he does begin the season on or off the IL, it's always going to be a question. This entire season is Wade's health and his ability to be on the field. So I do think it's a legitimate question. And where Tanner kind of took this is he asked, is there any likelihood of a Blake Snell or Jordan Montgomery in play on, a high average annual value, but for a low amount of years? And we also got one other question on that note, so I'll read that here too. But I Hate the Cardinals, who with great name, asked, would you know how much we are under the starting salaries from last season? Any chance we go for Snell, possibly for 1 year? If out of it, you could always trade him for more players at the break, he points out. So first, I looked into the numbers a little bit for where we started last season. Todd Rosiak had an article right before the season saying the Brewers were at 108,600,000 ish dollars going into opening day last year. Some other reports I saw had them more at 118 million. I'm not 100% sure which one was the most accurate, but I do trust Todd Rosiak, and it was a Brewers reporter reporting it, so it felt more accurate for me. By the end of the season, they did get up close to about $126 million spent. Obviously, they added guys like Canna and Carlos Santana in the middle of the season. Just how many times the Brewers kind of bring up and down guys, you end up paying a little bit more money doing that. Currently, they sit at around $95 million for their opening day payroll. So if we figure the 108 million, that means they'd have about 13 million. If we figure the 118 million, then they would obviously be 23 million-ish away from that number. Regarding Snell and Montgomery, for me, Montgomery is the guy that feels more possible and maybe more likely. I don't think either of them, I would not put either of them as likely at all. I did hear something that Montgomery likes playing in small markets, so that's a little bonus. I think he is the type of guy that would actually help this rotation a lot. Now, they're both good. Snell might even be the better overall pitcher. Montgomery is the one who can eat more innings and who goes deeper into games. Snell is known, everyone remembers the World Series game where he got pulled early, but that was actually a rare case where his pitch count was pretty low at that point in the game. As he's gotten, even in his best seasons here, he's been like a 5 to 6 innings max guy because he just runs up a pitch count with walks, strikeouts. He's almost like the three true outcome pitcher in some ways, but he limits homers better than obviously that type of pitcher would. But Montgomery, on the other hand, is a guy who can give you 7 or 8 in a good start, and I think that's more what the Brewers are going to be looking for is somebody. I think that's why even Lorenzen and Clevenger don't make a ton of sense for me because they'd be more of the same. They're both guys who maybe give you 100 innings in a season, where Montgomery's the one guy that you could add and potentially get 180 to 200 innings out of him. So if the deal is there and if he's willing to take a pillow contract, kind of like what we've seen with Rhys Hoskins' deal, there's more risk to giving a pitcher opt-outs or player options than there is a position player, just because we saw it with Woodruff. A pitcher injury can immediately shut you down for an entire season, whereas most position player injuries aren't going to do that short of like a torn ACL like Hoskins, of course, happened to have last year. But to answer the question, I would say Snell would shock me and Montgomery would surprise me, but I would be less surprised for Montgomery. I think there's an outside chance of it. The longer this goes, and the fact that he does seem to be interested in playing in a small market and maybe having one more good season before he hits the market again, that kind of adds up to a Brewers contract. It just feels like it might still end up out of their range. But Gunnar, do you have any thoughts on that yourself? Like when you look at it, do you think that they need to add another starter, or do you think that they could make it through there and it would be only maybe worth it if they can add somebody of true value?
Sort of along the same lines that you were talking about, and I've talked about this in other podcasts. I think when Jack was on, I mentioned how many starters you need to get through a year. I think we've got 7 or 8 guys right now that we can go to on the roster, 40-man guys who aren't in the 40-man right now that can come up. So I don't think it's a need that we need a starter now. If some of those guys hit, it really does not feel like a need at all. I think that's probably where the question marks are coming here from people. You mentioned the top end talent. If not to name names, because we're probably gonna go over it next podcast or something, but like say if Ashby hits or Hallway hits, that's now you got 3 solid starters. Now you're just filling in the last 2 guys in the back end of the rotation that we've always done pretty much. I mean, they always had injuries, whatever. So it's just kind of back to formula, I guess, for us. But I think it would help to get, as he mentioned, a mid-tier guy. I can kind of see Lorenzen, like you mentioned. I just don't feel like Montgomery to me is worth it probably for the price, and we haven't seen the Brewers. Now this is a different regime than what we grew up with even 7, 8 years ago. I guess Stearns is gone, so even that time is different. We haven't seen us go for shorter years, higher salary on pitchers necessarily. We've seen it with position players like Yaz, Reese Hoskins. Um, I mean, Kane's not really like that, but I mean, those types of guys we've seen it for position players. It feels riskier with pitchers, even though again, the risk isn't there necessarily because it's 1 year or whatever. But um, I do agree that he's maybe for all the reasons you said, I think he fits the mold of a Brewers pitcher. I just don't know if it's worth the price for. I don't see him taking 1 year. It doesn't really make sense to me, or 2 years doesn't make a ton of sense. But Snell definitely would move the needle, and that one's really fun if you could do that. That I would do a couple of years for, but again, that doesn't seem realistic at all. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just think we've got the guys that we need in-house, but if you wanted to go get a mid-tier guy to make yourself feel more comfortable, that would make a good amount of sense to me, I guess. But we gone over the names too. I mean, it's such a small window now of guys that I actually would like. We got Jacob Eunice too, who's another guy that we picked up, who's kind of that same type of mid-tier guy that we enjoyed. So um, I think we'll be okay. It's just people aren't used to us having three huge names at the top of the rotation where you don't even have to think about it anymore. Um, we just need to let it play out a little bit, and then maybe we could pivot later in the season. Like I think I mentioned that last episode too. Like if we were in a situation where, wow, we're in the top two of the division and we're in a playoff spot, but our starters are kind of lagging, I think we would pick up a starter or mid-tier guy even at the All-Star break that or trade deadline that we would need to go through into the playoffs if it was that big of a need. But right now, I just think I'd rather let it play out.
Yeah, I think what is being overlooked a little bit is how much Pat Murphy has talked about how he's going to be using these guys in kind of a different way than, again, what we've gotten used to the last few years. If you go back to 2018, it sounds more like how we used pitchers in 2018, which was unless you were absolutely shoving or the Brewers had a big lead and you had a low pitch count and there was no need to take you out, it was going to be like five and dive, and then you might give a guy who you might replace the starter with a guy who goes 3 to 4 himself, and you eat up an entire game without having to actually use your pen much. I think that's kind of how they're looking at it, almost piggyback starts, kind of splitting some of the starts. They've added so many guys who can stretch out. They're stretching out Bryce Wilson further in spring, it sounds like. He's already going 3 innings, which is another guy who he started in the past. He can go 4 or 5 if he gets stretched out to that point. So then you've got Junis, Wilson, Joe Ross, um, obviously Freddie, Miley. I'm thinking back end, I feel like I'm missing a name here. Well, Gosser probably at least at one point soon. You just have a lot, or Colin Ray, that's the one I was missing. Colin Ray. They have a lot of options of guys who can give you 4 or 5 innings, and you're hoping for the Freddie start to go 6 or 7 most of the time, probably. And you're hoping once in a while Miley might give you 6 or 7. I think Colin Ray is actually capable of going through an order 3 times, so I could see him, if he's pitching well, I can see him lasting 6 to 7 innings at times. There's not going to be a Corbin Burns on this staff, and that is going to be. I'm not even talking about performance wise. I'm talking about eating innings, and that is probably the thing I think the Brewers will miss the most about Burns is that he did give you 200 innings almost every year since the COVID year. That's hard to replace. It is probably the biggest deal to me. I think you can make up 90% of his production, but it's harder to do that when you're mixing in multiple pitchers to eat up to eat up the amount of innings he was throwing. So I do think they're going to continue to add depth throughout the year, like they did in the form of a Julio Teheran in the middle of the season last year. The Brewers can find these guys. They have other younger pitchers like Carlos F. Rodriguez, who's probably going to come up at one point, who can fill that same type of role. You could see Wichrowski being a multi-inning guy if he comes up at some point this year. Evan McKendry is a name that I don't think is getting talked about enough, but I like him quite a bit. I think he is an interesting back end of the rotation name, and he's done well in his short spring training stint so far. And I know that Murph at one point talked about him and said he was doing a good job. I I actually Jansen Junk is another name I haven't brought up yet, but he's another guy who stretches out and sounds like from what we've heard, he's added some velo more consistently that he thinks he's going to be able to hold deeper into games. We kind of saw it at the end of the year out of the bullpen, but he's another guy who can give you 4 or 5 innings a couple times through the order. I think they're just going to have to piece it together a little bit more than what they've done since 2018. But I don't think it's something they can't do. And I don't think it's something they don't have the pieces to do. It's just going to take some, I mean, it's going to take strong management of the pitching staff from Murphy and Hook and everybody involved in that. So to me, the mid-tier starter thing, honestly, I'm not a big fan of going that direction. I'll do it if Lorenzen's is the right price, but I would take Snell. Don't get me wrong earlier. I just don't think that's a possibility. I really do think if anybody is going to get signed out of that upper tier group left for the Brewers, I do think Montgomery's a possibility. And I do, to me, he's the one who makes the most sense. I think we'll see where it goes. My guess is he ends up back in Texas still. Honestly, I feel like that's where he's going to end up staying for if it's a 1 year deal. And you mentioned that it seems unlikely that they're going to get a 1 year deal, but season starts in a month. Like at some point here, they got to sign and they can keep holding out for this multi-year deal, but at some point it's not coming. And at some point teams start pulling offers because they want to figure out their roster and they don't want to be dealing with trying to negotiate as the season's coming up. So I think at some point their hand's going to be kind of forced into making a decision, but it'll probably still be like a Matt Chapman type deal where it's a year, but it's got opt-outs and player options and stuff so that if they struggle, then they take the money, and if they don't, they're right back on the market next year. But yeah, I think we did a pretty good job answering the question. I don't think we could talk too much more about that, but we do have another question here and kind of leads us right into our next topic, which is spring training stats and how much do they matter and how much should fans kind of read into them. So one of my buddies from high school, Jake Schultz, asked, from what we've seen from spring training so far, whose performance are you most excited about or happiest with? So, Gunnar, why don't you start with somebody who maybe has impressed you or you're excited to see him putting up some numbers. And then after that, I'll give mine and we'll talk a little bit about whether it really matters or how much it matters or anything along those lines.
Hmm. This will kind of give away my answer for that second part, but I get excited about watching the younger guys like Jackson Cheerio. I know people were excited having bigger days. Really all the young guys right now are hitting pretty good. It's the stats are solid. So I guess specifically you can just go down the line of those young guys, but I'll just leave it at that first because I can't answer the second part yet. Because I'll give away my answer for the second part. But is there somebody for sure for you that you had one guy that you are very you like what he's doing right now in spring training?
Yeah, I do. It's a random fringy reliever, of course, but JB Bukauskas is absolutely dominating, and I'm so happy they got this fourth option year for him. I really was hoping they'd find a way to keep him around, but he's thrown 4 innings, 9 strikeouts so far, just dominating every time he goes into the game. That's my guy that I'm picking for this. I don't really, I mean, I'm excited to watch, like Gunnar said. I like to see what people are doing. I wish more games were on TV so I could actually see what's going on more often, but taking as many bits and pieces as I can get, I like to see the process of people and I like to see people having good at bats or one thing that does carry over pretty well from spring is strikeouts and walks. Guys who take walks and guys who strike out a lot usually do the same things when they get into the season. Now, if it's a tiny sample, you can't read into that. Somebody's 0 for 4 with 2 strikeouts and it's a 50% strikeout rate. Like that is not going to carry over to the season most likely. But those types of things I like to watch for. But really, that's why Bukauskas excites me because 9 strikeouts in 4 innings, that's a sign that he clearly is getting swing and miss and that he's clearly losing. The hitters are having a tough time hitting him. So I think for me, in terms of what if fans should read in the spring training stats, if there's much to take away, I really do think for me, the only thing I pay much attention to is strikeouts, walks, and then the young guys, if they are performing, it's a good sign that they're at least capable of hitting major league pitching. It doesn't mean they're going to, but it gives me some hope, I guess, is what I would say in terms of, okay, they're going in here. This is their first time for a lot of them even seeing this level of pitching at any point. They might have seen one guy in Double-A who was on the doorstep to the majors or whatever, but seeing guys able to hit velocity, seeing guys able to read a breaking ball and take it in a tough count, that stuff matters a lot more to me than in the end 40 plate appearances worth of stats. Like that stuff just doesn't normalize in that time. And like I've talked about before, the other part of that is that pitchers, especially from the hitting perspective, pitchers are working on stuff in spring and they're not going out there with the sole intent to get you out like they are in the regular season. They're going out there because they're working on some. I'm going to throw 50% changeups today when in the regular season I'm going to throw 10%. And even if this doesn't make sense here, this is what I'm working on, so I'm going to throw it because I've already got my roster spot. I'm not proving anything to anybody. I'm just getting ready for the regular season. So to me, stats don't mean much, but I do think that the strikeout walk stuff is probably the most important and what I follow the most. But Gunnar, what are your thoughts on what to read into spring training performances?
Don't read into them. And I'll explain why here in a second, but going down the list of reasons why, first, you mentioned a good point. I think I would be more floored of guys who severely don't perform on like the bubble. So there was actually, you might have mentioned this to me too, of a Pat Murphy quote recently, and they're talking about um, this roster in general, like how many guys are um, competing for spots, like decisions you have to make, and he was just like not really a lot of decisions have to be made. And that could be part of like they already have a whiteboard somewhere and they've got the decisions down to a handful of stuff. But um, kind of just goes to show you how little performance really matters. But again, to go into my point here, young guys not performing in the bubble. So let's say Turang or Garrett Mitchell have horrendous springs. Those are guys who already had some red flags around them. So if they were already in the conversation, now you're getting more confirmation of like, ooh, they didn't make adjustments that they're supposed to. And that's not even really stats performance wise, but it could be if they're striking out a ton or whatever the case may be. Um, that could show it. But like you said, they're mentioning, or you mentioned working on stuff. Hitters work on stuff too. So Garrett had a hitch in his swing. Turang had a super long swing, a hole in his swing. They need time to actually work through those things and work through making it work too. So do you judge them on their stats in the first week and a half of spring if they're working on something? And then, I mean, I know Garrett, one of those first couple of weeks, I saw a bunch of tweets saying he was lining out his first couple at bats. Good swings. He was probably doing everything right, but in the box score, it was 0 for 2 or whatever it was. So that's why I don't read into stats. But mentioning those fringe guys too, relievers I could look at and say, based upon options, and like we'll talk about this part when the roster comes, but I can see those being more of a competition because it's just a game of chess of okay, I want this guy in the road or this guy in our bullpen, and then this guy won in the bullpen, but he's out of options, and so I got to take him over that guy so he can go in the minors. This guy really performed super well, and there's no way we can put him down. It just comes to all that stuff. And hitters wise, I can look at somebody like Jake Bauers, maybe who's on that bubble. I assume he'll still make the roster, but a guy who backup first baseman, DH, if somebody was also in that boat, maybe like a Brock Wilken is like super, super impressive and Jake Bauers is horrible, then it's a conversation. But even then, I think it would still be Jake Bauers. But I can see guys like that who are on that bubble fringe where it was so dramatic one way or another that the conversation started. But that's where I can slide this conversation into the guy we want to talk about next because of kind of sparking this conversation for us was Eric Haase. So he's had a humongous spring so far. Um, and I mentioned starting the conversation where three catchers is not ideal. And we'll talk about if that's a possibility anyways, because he's making it a conversation. And part of that conversation starting too is even if he doesn't make the roster, but he's still smoking the ball for me, he's would probably go to the minors, but or we now have a trade chip and he just got himself another job somewhere too. So stats in that sense to me could help you in the long run, even if it's not on the Brewers. You can still get yourself a job somewhere else because you started a conversation like Eric Haas has. So Spencer, if you want to lead us in this Eric Haas conversation, because I know you got some thoughts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that the way Murph was talking about Haas on Wednesday, I believe it was noticeable, very notable, it felt like.
Mm-hmm.
He was just complimenting him in every single way, just calling him a pro, saying, I love having this kid around. Obviously, to Murph, he's a kid. He's 31. He's not like one of the freshmen that we were going to talk about a little bit later, but he's having these results like you talked about. He's hitting the ball really well, which you go back 2 and 3 years ago, he hit the ball pretty well. Like it was a legitimately solid offensive season in 21 and 22. He was at least league average both of those years. So the Brewers were probably coming into this hoping, hey, we might find something with the bat again, and then he might be a valuable player. I think I should note, and there's been confusion on this, and I actually just found this out the other day, but even though it's a split contract for Haas, he is out of options, and they can't just send him down. They do have to put him on waivers. My guess is if he continues having the spring he's having and the lack of backup catchers around baseball, that he would not end up passing through waivers. You touched on a trade is definitely possible at that point, and honestly, that's kind of where I'm seeing this going. We did find out today that Gary Sanchez sounds like he had 6 live at bats, they said yesterday, and he had a homer, a double, and a single in those 6. So they think he's going to be ready in about a week to start playing in games. That would mean he would probably have enough time to get ready for the season, and there'd be no, barring a setback, he probably isn't starting the season on the IL like I thought he might. That just, to me, unless there's a catcher, and Haas has played some outfield, so I guess you can make this argument, but unless a catcher is like a really good athlete, like I could look at a Dalton Varsho when he was catching still more often, somebody who could go and legitimately play an outfield spot and play it well, and then also be the backup catcher or the third catcher, then maybe that's a possibility. I just think the risk of Gary Sanchez getting hurt in the middle of a game or Contreras getting hurt and you have to drop the DH for one game doesn't outweigh all the negatives that having much less flexibility comes with. And that's what 3 catchers does. It kills your flexibility. Now, what they're doing with Frelick, I think, is also part of the consideration for a guy like Haas is that, well, if Frelick can be an infielder, then maybe we don't need an extra infielder on the bench because Frelick could come in. We just put that extra outfielder in there. That's how we kind of combat having 2 of our bench players basically being catchers. I just think it's going to be hard. And you mentioned Bowers. I think having a guy like Haas and Bowers, guys who, yes, Bowers has also played a little bit of corner outfield, but Haas and Bowers are first basemen and catchers, and that's really the only place you want them to be on the field. Having 2 backup catchers and a backup first baseman, that is really limiting the flexibility, assuming that means you've got 1 to 2 open spots on the bench outside of that. And that's really hard to, I don't, it would be hard for me to justify it as the Brewers. Now, if they do it for a week and they want to see how it goes, like I wouldn't be shocked if they do that. I think sometimes people forget that the opening day roster these days only matters for like a couple days. And then it could be completely different. We've seen it. Ji-Man Choi in 2018 made the roster, scored the game-winning run in game 1, and was off the roster by game 2. We saw last year, Wiemer gets sent to Nashville. He doesn't even unpack his bags because he's going to Chicago because we have an injury in game 1. Like, the roster can change so quickly. It's opening day roster super fun to talk about. We're going to talk about it next episode or at least one soon, kind of what we're thinking is going to happen there. But it doesn't matter that much. So I could see them carrying him for a little bit, seeing if it works out, seeing if maybe Haas can cover a left field or a right field while Frelick plays infield and saying like, hey, maybe we could make this work for at least a little while. But I just think it's going to be really hard for that to make sense. So Gunnar, I know you were a little bit more open to it, I think, in our text the other day. So what are your thoughts on 3 catchers going into the start of the season?
I'm in the same boat as you, but I can also see a window where it works because if you view Gary more as a DH more, and he's going to back up catch too, obviously, but we want his bat in the lineup. So if you can make it work where he's the DH against lefties and he's not necessarily a backup catcher normally like a Victor Caratini. Victor's not going to DH. He's not going to play first base. He's strictly a backup catcher. I can see how that works, but also knowing the Brewers, we don't really have true DHs. Now, Gary will probably hit versus lefties in those situations, but lefties don't play every day usually. So it's not like righties. You see a lot more righties throughout the year. So I don't see us having a true DH. So I've already talked against my own argument there, which in retrospect, like you said, it kills your flexibility. Even if you made it work and had yourself a DH, now we have flexibility problems across the diamond because we're having a strict DH guy, which if he's hitting that, I won't care at that point, but whatever. I doubt he's going to be a true DH in that aspect. But just my last point too, I saw a Murph quote, which this one's not obvious. Anyone could have said this, but he did say for sure that in that same thing you're talking about how Williams going to catch a lot this year, which obviously no duh. But you don't have a prop like three catchers on a roster where you have a guy who's going to be catching 90% of the games. Is that fair to say? Like it's going to be a high number. Um, at the very least, he's going to be in a lineup too. So if he's not catching, he's probably DHing, obviously. So now you have a backup catcher for that guy when he's DHing. So I just think it kills your flexibility. I was obviously a big Eric Haas guy and a big guy, meaning like I was excited for this to happen. Really, I wanted the conversation to happen, just to give us more options there because I think that he could hit. It's just going to be a matter of can he catch, and if he could hit. I guess he sucked hitting last year too, so he's got to show it in real games. But I'm excited for that conversation to happen. I'm happy it's happening because it only means good things for the Brewers, like we both mentioned. Like we're gonna get something out of him performing good, hopefully at least. But yeah, I guess that's really all of it.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I do think a trade is in my head, if Gary's healthy, somebody's going to trade for Haas. That would be my guess. I think he ends up somewhere else, but I don't think that they have to waive him. I do think somebody will give us a flyer of some sort for him, especially if he does keep hitting like he has and showing a good process at the plate and everything. We did have a question from HC Purdy who asked, does Wes Clark have any chance to make the roster as a first base slash DH slash third catcher? Seems like he might help in terms of not having to keep Haas on the roster. He did hit his fourth homer of spring today. He's definitely been showing a lot of power. I will say, along the lines of strikeouts being something that carries over to the game, he is striking out quite a bit this spring as well. So I do like Wes Clark. I think he's got huge power, like huge power, probably the most in the system outside of maybe Wilkin. I don't know that I don't know that we won't see him at some point this season, but I don't think there's any reason to add him to the 40 man and then add him to the roster just to be that first base DH slash third catcher, especially because you kind of already have. I think Bowers, like you said, is going to make the roster and be that backup first baseman. I think he's going to DH against righties a decent amount. Gary's kind of your catcher slash lefties DH. I don't see a spot for him right now. Health is going to change over the course of the season, and he is a guy who might play his way into a chance because of if he goes to Nashville and just keeps hitting and he can at least manage the strikeouts, then sure, I could see him up this year, but not being on the 40 man, not being really that good of a catcher, really not being that good of a first baseman, being more of a DH that has big strikeout concerns, I'm not sure there's really a spot for him on the roster right now. But speaking of some of the younger guys, we touched on Weimer, Terang a little bit, Mitchell. We talked about Frelick for a little bit. Those are the freshmen from last year. We all saw the video series. They did a fantastic job on it. We're kind of talking about the sequel right now, though, and I'm hint, Brewers. I would love to see another type of a type of video like that from spring this year with some of these guys. But we'll talk about the people who are likely to make the roster in a little bit here. But Murph did have a quote regarding Brock Wilkin and Jacob Wichrowski, who both got reassigned to minor league camp earlier this week. And I think some Brewer fans were holding out some hope, I guess, that they might make the roster out of spring. To me, that was never happening. I never had either of them even somewhat on the radar for making the team out of spring. For Wichrowski, it's better for him to go down, continue to get stretched out as a starter. Maybe at some point later in the year, you bring him up and he's a reliever, and then you can put him back in the rotation. But I think long term, you want to make sure he can stay stretched out as a starter. In terms of Wilkin, he's done a lot of good things, and he looked really comfortable at the major league level in spring training, but he has played like 10 games in Double-A. He needs some experience. He's got to get some at bat. Now, if he starts in Triple-A this year, it wouldn't shock me. The way he dominated spring when he was up, the way he looked in Double-A, and he's hit at every level, like they might just push him to Triple-A. That wouldn't shock me. But Murph was asked about their potential to debut in the big leagues at some point this year, and he said, I think it's a possibility for both of them. I can't tell you when, and it's not definite, but it is a possibility. So I guess of those two, Gunnar, which one would maybe you be more surprised to see, or do you expect to see either of them at some point this year?
I'd be most surprised to see Brock Wilken, as you alluded to. Love the power, love the hitting potential. If we get that guy in the big leagues for years to come, that's exactly what we want. Like you mentioned, and kind of going into our spring stats conversation, like there wasn't going to be much that he could show me this spring that was going to be like he needs to be on the roster for all the reasons you just said. I think there's maybe one too many guys in front of him who don't deserve it any more than he does, but probably already in pencil on the roster where it makes more sense. Um, like you said, he's had a fast ascend already. I get PTSD a little bit of a guy named Keston Hira. I'm not saying that's the type of hitter he is even, but power guy. Brewers haven't always done great with power guys. Maybe those stats could be a little deceptive, and I guess Joey Weimer kind of goes in that conversation too. He kind of had a fast ascent actually, himself. So um, I don't think he'll have as many corrections to fix as those two guys either. But like you said, I just want to see it a little bit more. I don't need to rush him because of all the other options that we have in front of him right now. And I would just out of those two guys, I'd be more likely to or less likely to see him. But speaking of the other guy, I would say it feels above 50% chance that he'll be on the roster at some point because, as you mentioned, you could throw him in the bullpen and he's going to be super effective, like a Corbin Burns in 2018 or Freddie even too with that and Woodruff at that. So there's this a much more realistic path for him to be on the team versus Wilkin, where you gotta bullpen's just easier to figure out, I guess. And a lot less detrimental to the guy because if he struggles a little bit, you throw him back down and work on your starting, you come back up next year and you're good to go. So, yeah, I mean, out of those two guys, I'm excited to see both of them, but Wilkin just feels a little too fast for me. And Mizorowski, I could literally see on this team at some point, and I could see him producing at a high level because his stuff plays extremely well. If it was 1 to 2 innings, and if he's starting, that's even more of a plus, which it feels like maybe he could, but I don't know if I don't see him starting maybe this year, but I'd be excited if he was. But
Yeah.
um, yeah,
I would be pretty surprised if we see him make a start other than maybe like a end of season start just because we need somebody to make a start.
yeah,
But again, I kind of want to go back to this 40 man thing. Like, I think people misunderstand sometimes how important and how much the Brewers value 40 man spots. They're not just going to add a young guy to the 40 to put him on the roster to be a platoon guy or a backup guy or somebody who's not really an everyday player. Tyler Black is not currently on the 40 man. I think it's going to make it a lot harder for him to make the opening day roster. I think he would have had to have an insane spring and that you probably would have needed to see some guys struggling, maybe even some injuries. Oliver Dunn, on the other hand, on the 40 man. I think that gives him a pretty decent chance to make the roster like we talked about last time with Gunnar being your kind of surprise pick to potentially make it. I agree with you. Mizorowski to me is by far the more likely one to make the roster. And it's kind of because of a lot of the people I've named and listed already this podcast. Tyler Black is ahead of Wilkin in terms of his path to the big leagues right now. You have even Wes Clark, arguably, if you're looking at Wilkin as more of a first baseman, like Clark's probably taking that spot first. First base is covered by Reese. It's backed up by Bowers. If both of them have terrible struggles or injury, then you're probably looking at a Clark or even a Tyler Black at that point. Third base, you're kind of looking at potentially Ortiz, potentially Dunn. You've got Monasterio. Not that I think he should be blocking anybody, but he's there right now. And that's not a knock on Monasterio. I just think there's way more ceiling, obviously, to these other guys. He's done way more than I could have expected him to do. So I enjoy watching Andrew Monasterio, but I don't think I don't expect the type of production we got for like a few weeks last year to ever show up again. I think that was a little more a flash in the pan, and he'll settle in as a fine utility type player. But it just feels like he's really blocked. And like you said, with Mizorowski, at some point his stuff isn't blocked by anybody because it's just as good as anybody's. And if he can command it well enough for an inning or two, he's going to come up and he's going to get outs, and it's going to be really fun to watch. So I would be more surprised to see Wilkin. I would be almost more surprised to not see Mizorowski at some point. I think it would take some injury for him. It would probably take a huge collapse in the command because oftentimes he's been able to have decent command early in starts and then it's fallen off. So that to me screams reliever at the moment. And then you bring him up, have him relief, like you said, with Burns, Woodruff, Freddie. All those guys were able to stay stretched out because they only relieved for half a season or whatever it was. So you can make it work. And I think that is easily the one I would be more, I think is a lot more likely to show up. But in terms of, I guess, just the rookies in general, who do you think, Gunnar, will have the biggest impact? And maybe let's limit this to non-Churio rookies. So we're going to exclude him. I'm not even sure he's the answer, but let's just take him out of the equation and look at some of the other guys and say who you think of potential first year players will have the biggest impact.
Yeah, Cheerio is in the same boat to me as like Hall or Ortiz because we feel pretty confident they're going to get a big role right away. Um, I was the one who eliminated Cheerio because I figured we'd probably both semi pick him if whoever we pick next. It's just because we think he's really good and he's going to be playing every day. But because along those lines, to me, it came down to Hall or Ortiz, and I might shock you. Well, not. I was bragging about this guy last episode, so now I can't shock you anymore. But I think it will be Ortiz. If you look at like somebody like Bryce Terang last year, I think he had like a one over one WAR, which we all know how horrendous he was on offense, and to have a one WAR plus that is incredible. I think Joey didn't even break one WAR, and he had incredible defense. And of course, same kind of deal there. He hit a little better, but not much better. So I just think he's going to hit better than both of those guys. I presume at least his defense going to be what we know him as is going to be the same amount of caliber. If you compare it to Turang, since it's the infielder too. So, um, I just think he's more of a well-rounded player. I can bet on him being productive on one side of the ball, almost guaranteed. And then I believe in the hitting probably more than I should right now. So I'm too excited about him. And then since I brought up Hall, I think he's going to be in the same boat. It's just impact wise. Let's say he doesn't get off to a hot start as a starting pitcher, then you move him to the bullpen, he might rock there. But how valuable is he at that point versus when he was a starter? If he could be valuable now, if he's a starter and he's like our number two starter by the end of the year, um, that's a huge game changer. So that I could totally see him surpassing Ortiz in that uh aspect. But um, yeah, do you got anybody different, or is it one of those two guys? As I'm guessing.
No, I would probably lean towards those two guys. I did consider Gosser. I could just see him being
Yep.
of the young pitchers. I do think he's the most likely to be able to go deeper into games and kind of hold a 6 inning start and kind of be that type of guy where it's probably going to be a 4-ish ERA. But if you're given 5 to 6 innings every start of 4 ERA ball, like that's going to be two or if you pitch the whole season, which I think he might, I'm not I'm not super confident he's going to make the roster out of spring like I was thinking going into it, but I do think there's a decent chance he makes quite a few starts. And if he is the type of just solid back end starter that I'm thinking he could be, there's a chance he outpaces both of those two guys you talked about. I would lean towards Ortiz though too if I have to give my answer. I think there's a pretty good chance he's the best. I did just look up Fangraphs where it looks like Weimer was actually 1.1 and Terang was 0.2. I'm guessing you were on Baseball Reference, which
Yeah, I
they
must say the
often are.
opposite.
They disagree on defensive metrics a decent amount sometimes, so that
Or
can
I'm
make a
dyslexic and I just completely read them backwards.
that might be it too. But yeah, I the defense can carry that type of.
Yeah,
I
either
mean,
way.
Blake Perkins was 1.2 WAR, and he, I guess technically, I mean, yeah, he was worse than. No, he was better than Weimer technically at the plate, but the defense was really good too, and that type of thing can just. We saw it with like Keon Broxton, guys like that. Like if you play really good defense, even if the bat's not great, you can make up for it. And like we talked about last episode, I do think Ortiz has the ability to be. I don't expect him to hit like I think he's capable of this year, like all the way to what I think he's capable of. But if you told me he's a league average hitter with really good defense, that wouldn't shock me at all. And that's a really, really solid player. So I think he would be my answer as well. But that I guess that kind of leads us into the spring breakout games you talked about earlier, Gunnar. So why don't you give us
Mhm.
a little rundown on what that is and how it works, and then we can kind of go through the roster that the Brewers are sending to their game.
Yep. So this is a brand new thing. And I went to MLB.com to get their exact definition of it, so no one is confused here because I was even a little confused at what this was because I thought originally it might be like a kind of like a futures game is what I imagined it as. It's like the top prospects in one game, but that's not what we're looking at here. So as I mentioned, per MLB.com, they describe it as MLB Spring Breakout is a 4-day event showcasing baseball's future, the current stars of minor league baseball. The inaugural edition will be held from March 14th to March 17th at Grapefruit and Cactus League stadiums during spring training. A series of 16 exhibition games will be played between teams comprised of each MLB's organization's top prospects. So the Brewers are going to feature their top last four first round picks, that being Brock Wilken, Josh Knopf, who someone we haven't mentioned actually much on this podcast. I know you're excited about him. This next guy you talk about quite a bit, Eric Brown Jr., and then my favorite, Tyler Black. The Brewers' specific game is on the last day of March 17th versus the Royals. I can quick over this roster here, Spencer. So if you want to take a nap, I can just read through it. So the pitchers, we got Jacob Mizorowski, Robert Gasser, Carlos Rodriguez, Josh Nath, Logan Henderson, Bradley Blaylock, Bishop Lenson, Patricio Aquino, Shane Smith, and Justin Yeager. Catcher, we only got one catcher, Justin Jefferson Quero. Infielders, Tyler Black, as I mentioned, Brock Wilken, as I mentioned, Cooper Pratt, who's somebody everyone's very excited about. So I feel like to see him. Eric Brown Jr., as I mentioned, Eric Benetti, Mike Bove, Luke Adams, Daniel Galarte, Juan Baez, Wes Clark, and then the outfielders, Jackson Cherio, obviously, Luis Lara, Joffrey Rodriguez, and Dylan O'Ray. So, Spencer, I guess we can kind of wrap this up and describe it as how would you describe these games? Is this good for baseball? Sometimes spring training gets to the casual fan. We can't even watch our own games right now, so at least a good chunk of them. So, is this good for baseball exposure wise? And just in general, are you excited for this type of game to have the Brewers and specifically present all these prospects in one sitting, which that's not always what spring training is.
Yeah. No, I'm pumped about this. I'll probably be watching a decent amount of the games because they are supposed to be all available on some sort of, I think it's going to be on MLB TV, but
Yeah.
I'll probably be watching a decent amount of them. I think for the Brewers, just seeing, you mentioned Josh Noth, some of the guys we really haven't had a chance to see. I'm hoping, how many pitchers are on the roster? 10? Okay. I'm hoping it's just kind of a one inning thing. Each guy goes out there for an inning and all these guys get a chance. Obviously, that would require an extra inning for one of them, but Bishop Letson was a 10th or 11th, I want to say 10th or I can't remember, 10th or 11th round pick last year out of high school. I was kind of surprised they were able to sign him. I would love to see him pitch and just see how it looks. Noth is a guy you mentioned. I really want to see him pitch. Logan Henderson is a guy that I have liked for a long time. Fastball last year was like 92 to 94. Now, apparently in spring, he's sitting 95 to 97. He's got really good characteristics. He's kind of got the Devin Williams screwball changeup. It's nasty. It's probably the best changeup in the system. It's probably one of the best changeups in minor league baseball. So his jump and velo, I'm really excited to see that. I guess he made some changes to his slider, which is going to be super important for him. But some of these names, just getting the chance to see them, like you said, Cooper Pratt, I hope we get to see him a little bit. He has had at least one or two MLB spring training plate appearances. He lined out on one of them to center, I know, but I enjoy his swing a lot. I think he's capable of sticking at short. Eric Batanti, we haven't seen, but it'd be cool to see him face some decent pitching. Mike Bovee has been in a couple spring games, but a lot of these names, Yoferi Rodriguez has actually been in a few of them too, but just to see them in an environment against other teams' best prospects, I obviously don't care who wins or what the score is or anything like that, but it'll be another opportunity for some of these guys to just show how they stack up against other guys, other peers for them. And then, I don't know, I'm really excited. I'll definitely be watching. If I can't watch it live, I'll watch it later or something, but I encourage people who are able to watch it. And I know I didn't really answer any of your questions, so I'm going to circle back to that. But in terms of, is it good for baseball? I think it's great for baseball. I think it's really a good idea for them to keep pushing minor league baseball as a positive, as something that's fun. Like, obviously, for me, it is. I love watching minor league baseball. I might enjoy it more than I watch Major League Baseball. Like, if I have the choice to watch a random minor league game versus a random Major League game, I would rather watch the random minor league game. I think all these guys getting an opportunity to showcase themselves, to have people know their names. I think some people think that puts more pressure on the players. For me, I think it's just in some cases, I'm sure some fans now they know a guy, so now they're like, hey, he didn't do well. Like the Brewers suck at developing and stuff like that happens. I know it does when they do these lists and everything, but the more people know about players, I think the cooler it is for one, as someone who's been doing some tweeting, some prospect writing and stuff, the coolest part about doing that is definitely having some of like the family members reach out to me and say, "Oh, thanks for kind of highlighting him or talking about him. Like it's really cool. All his family's reading this. Like his friends are reading this. That's really cool. I think it's overlooked how much like parents and friends and people are proud to see these guys out there. So them getting a chance to be showcased, like for a lot of those families, it might be the first time they ever get to watch them on a real broadcast, on a real TV screen, playing baseball in a Brewers uniform against other team, like another team. And I think that's a really cool part of it too. But I hope it brings attention to the minor leagues and shows like how entertaining it can be. Um, I guess you did have a question here. You were going to ask me about who I wanted to spotlight, but I already went through that. But
Yeah.
I think it's just for me, I want to see the guys that I haven't seen because most of the ones that I'm hoping to see are ones who haven't really been in full season ball. But for a lot of people, I think it's the first chance to watch some of the top prospects that even Churio. Some people haven't actually gotten to watch Churio in a game. Even Wichrowski, you might have seen him in the Futures game for that inning, but other than that, they haven't been on TV very often for just people to watch unless you're paying for minor league baseball TV. So I think it's just an opportunity for everybody to get a chance to put their name out there, to go out and compete. And I think it's going to be, I hope they do it right. I hope it's well presented on TV. I hope they have legitimate broadcast crews there. My guess is they will, but MLB can have a good idea and then somehow screw it up sometimes. That wouldn't be abnormal for them. I'm I don't have too much more to add. I do think this is a really, really good idea, and I almost hope they build upon it in the future and maybe make it a series of 3 games with 3 different teams. Like
Hmm.
in the middle of in the middle of spring training, there's plenty of time for something like that. We've seen the World Baseball Classic happen during that. Like players are away from the team. It's okay if they miss a few days to go do this instead of being with the normal big league camp for like a Jackson Churio or a Mizorowski or a Quero. So I hope this turns into something even bigger, and I hope it sheds a light on the abilities of minor league baseball players more than anything else. So, yeah, Gunnar, do you have anything else you wanted to add on this, or
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I think this was even better than I thought originally. I thought maybe it was going to be a futures game, like I mentioned, of all the top prospects, which to us, to everybody, that would be fun. Like I thought it was gonna be a one-off event, but we got even better where we got a whole showcase of a weekend of everyone's future games, like every single team's futures. Um, I was gonna make a joke to you because we're fortunate enough to have a good system and a bunch of guys who we're excited to see. Um, Imagine if we're like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we got to watch Caleb Gindel, Taylor Green, Mark Rogers be our representatives for this game. But instead, our backups are some people that we're excited about or perceived backups in this game are going to be guys that we want to see. So you mentioned Cooper Pratt, and I was going to answer my own question of who I was most excited to see. There's a couple of guys. I mentioned Nath. That was a guy because of you. I'm excited to see. But with Pratt, I saw they interviewed him after one of these games, um, and he was talking about how, for people who don't know, he was going to be maybe a topper prospect or a topper round guy, but he ends up going 6th round with the Brewers. And they're like, "Do you regret that decision at all? Because it was a little unorthodox how you anybody else. He was going to what college was he going to? I mean, it's a big college of college baseball, so
Ole
uh,
Miss?
yeah, so I mean, he could easily have pulled back and gone there and been a top 2 round pick easily. But he was like, no, I haven't regretted it one bit right now. Like ever since I got in the organization, they treated me so nice and all the good stuff that we've been talking about, what we're perceived to be doing is paying off because Um, that's even something we haven't seen of taking advantage of later round picks with high potential like that, and being able to pull him in. And a guy he's played in one spring training barely, and he's already excited and has zero regrets about his decision, well, at least what he's saying. So, um, just the player wise, though, I'd be excited to see it. It was nice to hear from him in that aspect too. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a really cool event, I guess, is this the best way to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm like I said, I'm just gonna find a way to watch it no matter what, and I would encourage anybody able to check it out, see what the future holds for the Brewers because it is really bright, and this doesn't even include all of the guys that I'm excited about in the obviously I've got my spreadsheet of 140 plus guys right now, so I'm excited about way too many players, but there's there's a lot to enjoy with minor league baseball, and honestly, like now that I'm already talking about it, like if you're close to a minor league stadium, if you're close to a minor league team, Brewers are not. Like it's a great experience. It's a really fun time to go to a game. You can choose to really enjoy the baseball and to dissect the baseball, which is what I spend most of my time doing there, but like it's an entertainment thing too. So it's great for kids. I would say it's probably one of the better places to introduce kids to baseball. They're not going to be annoying people by moving around or doing stuff like that's part of it. Everybody knows that's part of it at a minor league game. Lots of mascots and all that stuff happening at minor league games. So I always do my best to make it up to Appleton a couple times a year. I've been going to Beloit when the Timber Rattlers play there a couple times a year. Recently, it's if you're in that area, definitely check it out. If you're in the area of any minor league team, I think it's well worth the time. It's pretty inexpensive. Ironically, sometimes the tickets are a little bit more to get in the game than like a cheap Brewer ticket would be, but you're going to get a really good seat. The food, the parking, everything else is going to be much cheaper than an actual major league game. So definitely just want to throw that out there as something I would recommend. But to move forward here, we obviously have had some more spring training games go by. We're hearing more and more about the team. I think just to touch on some of the stuff we've seen recently, we'll start with some of the pitching stuff. Aaron Ashby made a start today. He sat 93 to 94 and touched 96, which that to me is one of the most important things I could see. His command wasn't great. It's a work in progress, but the stuff is getting closer to where it used to be. Like I touched on before, when I watched him in the minors last year, it was hard to watch. It didn't look right. He didn't look comfortable. Stuff wasn't moving how you want it to. Velo was in the mid to upper 80s. Like it was tough to watch. And today he looked a lot more like himself. I think the command is going to be, it's not like he had pinpoint command before this injury, so it's always going to be a little bit of a concern with him, but I do think he looked a lot more like himself. Frankly, I do think he's probably going to start this year in AAA just so that they can continue to build him up without the risk and the pressure of trying to get major league outs. But this was a really big step, and I was really happy to see him look this way in a game, frankly, a little bit earlier than I was expecting him to. And then another lefty that I want to talk about is the recently acquired from the Dodgers, Brian Hudson. There was a really good article from Matthew Trueblood of Brewer Fanatic talking about how Hudson was working on cleaning up some of his mechanics. And he's actually now been able to get up to 7.8 feet of extension on his fastball, which I I believe the highest in baseball last year was 7.6 from Alexis Diaz. So, I mean, Hudson's a tall, tall dude. So the extension's always going to be there. He was at like 7.1 last year, but you add another half foot to it, it's just another half mile per hour or so, even a mile per hour that you're adding to that effective, the velocity that a hitter is seeing, which is more important than what the radar gun says. Because you combine that extension, he cleaned up the mechanics, and he's been up to 96 in the past. He kind of sat in that 91, 92 range, but little bit of a cleanup with the mechanics and adding that even a little bit more extension, you're kind of looking at him in like the 95 or higher range on his effective velocity. And he has good characteristics on the fastball that'll make it play up even more. And then he's working on improving that slider, which that'll probably be the biggest difference maker for him, is that he has a really good fastball that gets really good results. The secondaries have kind of been lacking at times. So if the slider is improved as well, I think you're going to see Hudson make a pretty big impact at some point this season. I don't think he makes the opening day roster because of him having the ability to be optioned, but those are the types of I do want to shout out Matthew Trueblood for his coverage the week he was in Arizona. I mean, I think he put out 16 or 17 articles during that week, and they were all covering just kind of the minute details of the team. That's the type of stuff that I want to hear about in spring. I love Christian Yelich. I love Willie Adames. I love all those guys. I don't need to hear that they are hitting the ball hard in batting practice. Like that doesn't do much for me. That's not going to be something I care that much about. Like, yeah, I know they're doing that. They're good hitters. They're capable hitters. I want to know about some of the guys who are on the fringes and some of the guys who are fighting to get a chance. Like that's the type of stuff I want to learn about. So he had a really good Jansen Junk article as well. I think he had a Colin Ray article. He kind of touched on all of the fringier players and what they're working on and how they've improved. And so I would encourage people to go check all of those out and give them a listen. Really, really good stuff. But that was one I found super interesting. And then I tweeted about this guy today, but Tyler Woessner, he was a mid-round pick in the draft 2 years ago. He was a JUCO guy, but he was a weird JUCO guy because he actually played 4 years at a JUCO. And he was a 23-year-old being drafted out of a junior college, which is really weird. He sits more in like that 92 to 90, 95 range last year when he was starting. In spring this year, he's been up to 99 and he's been sitting more in like the 96, 97 range. Today, he was up to 97. He threw 2 scoreless innings. He's now thrown 4 scoreless innings in 3 major league games in spring. They asked Murph about him, and his quote was, "That's 3 times now. 3 times he's been over here, and I'm going to ask for him again. I love him. That kid looks really good." I tweeted about him this morning. He obviously had that performance today, but he's one I'm going to be watching. He throws 6 pitches, and now his velo's jumping. He's got pretty good command. Like, that's the type of guy who could be a breakout starting pitching prospect, and he was already in my top 30. I think I've got him at like 27 right now. I I could see him being a type of guy who, if he can keep the velo as a starter, that's the type of guy who starts jumping up towards like the top 10 in the system because of the pitch mix, the decent command, and then the velocity on top of it. That's the type of guy who can make a real jump as a prospect. And then one more pitcher who stood out, and he came in today, and I had not seen him pitch. I don't know if he had pitched in pro ball prior to spring training. The 13th round pick in last year's draft, Brett Wichrowski. I don't know how you pronounce it for sure. He was touching 99 today in a scoreless inning. He had a strikeout. This is a guy who in college sat in like the 93 to 96 range out of the pen. And as a starter, he was more in like the 91 to 93 range. Throwing 99 only 7 or 8 months later, he's clearly somebody the Brewers found that had some untapped development left in him. And if you do watch him pitch, if you have the chance to look at any video of him, it's one of the smoothest looking deliveries I've seen in a while. And when I did my short draft write-up on him for Brewer Fanatic back when the draft happened, I did point that out, that it's a really clean operation and it looks like somebody who could add some velocity. I was not expecting to see near triple digits immediately after being drafted, though. He's one I'm going to be watching. That I don't know that he's a starter candidate. He's mostly a two-pitch guy, but it's a good slider, and that's the type of reliever who can move really quickly with that type of velocity. So I'm interested. It wouldn't be shocking to me if he was a college guy, so it wouldn't shock me if he heads to like high A Appleton to make his pro debut instead of starting in low A or even in the Arizona League. That type of stuff will play right away. So that was one not really expecting to see that today. And then all of a sudden he came out and was touching 99. And I was like, oh, okay. You've got my attention. And then in terms of position players, I just want to talk about Jefferson Quero. That's really the only reason I'm even talking about position players. But opponents are 3 for 8 on stolen base attempts against him this spring. Nobody else in baseball or in Major League camp has thrown out 5 base runners. Quero's done it, and he's done it on only 8 attempts. So this is genuinely, he can be a game changer defensively at catcher. He receives incredibly well. He has one of the best arms in baseball. If you look at a guy like Patrick Bailey on the Giants, what he did for that team last year when he came in, where his defense was just ridiculous. Quero's not going to be as flashy, I don't think. Like, Patrick Bailey's making sidearm throws like an infielder and shoving 1.7 pop times. Like, he's on a different level. He's probably the best defensive catcher I have seen. I have a hatred of Yadi Molina. I do respect his defensive abilities, to me, already, I would view Patrick Bailey as a much better defender than Yadier Molina, and that is not even meant as a knock on Yadi. He was very good defensively. Patrick
Not to
Bailey,
cut you off, but I was going to bring up Yadi Molina because I saw a stat and they said since like 2002 or 4, whenever he came up, that they went over everyone's organization, how many stolen bases you gave up, and the Cardinals were like 500 less stolen bases.
oh yeah,
And I instantly thought of that when I've seen his throwing out guys in spring training now and his success rate now. And then I saw that stat and I'm like, I tied those two guys together, which is kind of funny.
yeah. I mean, at some point, what happens is if you do throw people out so consistently,
They don't run.
they don't run.
Yeah.
And that's almost more important than being able to throw guys out in the moment is
Hmm.
to prevent them from even trying. It's a huge weapon to have on your team if teams are afraid to run against you. So we've talked about Quero a lot. I don't really expect him to be up at any point early in the season this year, now that Sanchez is here, but I still think there's a pretty decent chance we see him by September this season. And when you get the 2 extra roster spots and maybe a third catcher makes a lot more sense at that point, that might be when you see him. He also had a 12 pitch at bat ending in a homer on Sunday. He's a good player. I don't think his stats are great in spring offensively. I think his OPS is a little under 700, but he is a good baseball player. He will figure it out at the plate, and the defense is going to be so good that the bat just doesn't have to be that good. And then one more update, I guess. You may have seen that Joey Wiemer left the game early today. He slipped a little bit. It had rained. There was a rain delay. He slipped as he was kind of going from the grass to the outfield warning track. He's fine. Kurt Hogue said that he's just fine. He was going to have to come out of the game anyway because he is traveling to Las Vegas, which is where the Brewers are playing a couple games this weekend. But they were kind of precautionary with him and just took him out just to make sure everything was fine. But he is good. So we did have one other listener question that we can get to here. That was also from HC Purdy. He was asking, what do you guys think of Mike Bovee? He doesn't seem to have enough power to be a corner infield type. I I will say this in pro ball, I believe he played a little bit of third, but he has almost exclusively played second. And it sounds like that's what they told him to focus on this offseason. So, Gunnar, we've talked about this before. I think it gets overrated at times. The certain abilities fitting with certain positions thing, as long as the positional depth in your organization lines up with what you need overall. So if you have a shortstop who hits for power, that's not really usually traditionally a position of power, and you don't have one who does at third base. I feel like that just cancels each other out, and it doesn't really matter in that scenario. So I don't worry too much about that. I do like Mike Bovee. I wanted the Brewers to draft him. I have some concerns. I had some concerns watching him in Appleton that he may struggle with velo, at least early on. Playing at a small school like Nebraska Omaha, he probably didn't see much velo. He did pretty well against some of the bigger teams. Like he faced Tennessee. He had good results against Tennessee. But I think he could be a little bit of a slower, like developer in terms of catching up to velo and maybe hitting some of the better breaking balls. But I do think he has a really good feel for hitting, and I do think there's more power than what people were expecting. I was super high on him going into the draft. Funny enough, I was very high on Bovee, super low on Wilkin, not as a player, but just because of the fit with the organization. And I would say I'm probably lower on Bovee than most people now, and I might be higher on Wilkin than most people now. So that's how quickly they changed my mind in some ways. But I do still like Bovee quite a bit, and he's still like a top 20, maybe even top 15 guy for me in the system. But Gunnar, why don't you talk a little bit here about just how you've talked about this with me before, and I think we have had this discussion before, but how you view kind of roster construction versus this guy plays this position, so he has to have power. This guy plays this position, so he has to have speed, like that type of stuff.
If you weren't going to say it, I was going to speak up. This completely triggered me once again, but it is a real thing. Like, there's a reason why I brought it up because it's a thing. I think we, me and you went to Appleton, as you mentioned, going to minor league games. We actually went together and watched Mike Bovee, I believe, in Appleton. He's got like you mentioned, he's a good hitter, and the sample is so small. I think I looked it up quickly while you're talking. It looked like maybe like 80 at bats he had. In that sample, like 3 extra base hits. I get it, it's concerning, but he just seemed like a good hitter to where you mentioned it might take a couple more years Something we're maybe not used to now with all these guys coming up very fast, but that's totally fine. We have the opportunity now where in the next coming of years, I think a lot of those spots aren't going to be as open as they seem right now too. So it's not going to be a fact of like we need to get him up and he needs to produce, he needs to hit, whatever the case may be. But in general, to answer your question, yeah, I don't to say like he doesn't have enough power to be like a third baseman or first baseman, it just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. It correlates it. Now, if the Brewers are lacking in power and we can go get a first baseman or third baseman who has power at that time when he is ready to come up and he has not shown any power whatsoever, and we have an opportunity to get guys, because let's be honest, those guys are usually the bigger guys. They're the bulkier guys. They're the guys who hit the home runs. So odds are higher that that position you're going to get a power hitter. So it, like you mentioned, it comes down to roster and everything like that too. But looking at our sort of organization now, Brock Wilkins, a guy who has power, Joey Weimer might have power. We might not need that power by the time he's ready to come too. So it's just a full organization roster thing you have to look at more than, don't let that affect how you view Mike Bovee, I guess, if he doesn't hit 20 home runs next year, 30 doubles next year, whatever the case may be. If he's doing the right stuff, just let him time, give him time to kind of master all of his skills. Or if that ever pops up, and if it doesn't pop up, I don't think it's a huge deal either.
Yeah, agreed. All right, let's finish up with a few other kind of notes we had. Our old friend Eric Lauer signed a minor league deal with the Pirates. So I guess that's a pretty decent opportunity probably for him to potentially get a shot in the majors at some point. Pirates rotation isn't awful, but I don't think there's a ton of depth there, and I think it's not great for sure. Um, he's going to have to figure out some stuff. He's a long ways away from being a major league pitcher from the last we saw of him. But good for him to get another opportunity. I wondered if he might end up overseas. So guess if that's what he wanted, good for him for staying in affiliated ball. And then I guess we have some prospect stuff, which I'm always happy to talk about. Fangraphs released their top 42 is what it ended up being. So he always goes, Eric Longenhagen always goes, anybody with 35 plus future value is who he includes in his list. Last year, I believe the Brewers had 38 at this time. 42 is a really, really good sign of good depth. There's not many teams getting that many put on their list. They had 30 guys with 40 or higher future value, which is, I would imagine, one of the highest you're going to see in baseball. They do have really good depth right now. I will say he is probably the low guy on the Brewers system, and he is definitely the low man on Tyler Black. He has him at 10 in the system. He views him as more of a utility type player. He doesn't see him as an everyday player at any point. His write-up is interesting because it feels complimentary, and then immediately he takes back his compliments every time he talks. But he talks about he has a great eye. He's very fast. He plays really hard, and he swings pretty hard for his size. He even talks about how he's improved quite a bit defensively in terms of his third base ability, at least. But he does talk about, and this is something I would agree with, I think his throwing motion is weird and that it's going to be hard for him to be consistent with his throws the way he throws across the diamond. Like, I don't disagree with that. I think that's fair. He talks about how first base and eventually corner outfield are a pretty good chance for him. No disagreement there. I've said the exact same thing on this podcast. The issue he has is that he thinks there's more holes in his swing than most people do. He said he's really struggled with pitches up and away, and he thinks major league pitchers are going to attack that, and that he's going to have a hard time laying off of it. He thinks that the defense is never really going to play very well at any one position, meaning he'll kind of move around, and he'll have this spot because of his great plate discipline and his ability to hit the ball, but he thinks his bat to ball is a lot worse than most people, and that's really where he's getting downgraded. He also doesn't think there's much real power to his game. I get why both of those things might. I understand where he's coming from on both of those, especially the power one. I could see that being the case, but I do think the bat to ball skills are better than he does, and I think he's just almost over analyzing Tyler Black versus other players. And that sometimes happens when you have a preconceived notion about a guy, and he's kind of always been the low guy on Black. So this doesn't shock me. I think he I think Tyler Black will outplay what Longenhagen has here, but I will give this like he does really good work and he does not care what other people think. And I respect that a lot. In a prospect evaluator, a lot of people just go out and say what other people say because it's safe. You're never going to get backlash if everybody's wrong about a guy. But if you're the one guy who's believing in what he sees and what he is going out there and like he goes out and evaluates every single player, he also covers the entire league pretty much by himself. To me, that makes it impossible for you to really know what each guy does. And I think you just see a guy play once and you're like, oh, yeah, he had a bad defensive game. He's a bad defensive player. And I'm not sure that's exactly how it works, but he does a lot of research. He's very good at his job. He just always has players that he's much higher on and much lower on than others. I'm not going to go in depth on the others as much, but he is lower on Carlos F. Rodriguez than others, mostly just because he doesn't think he has like a carrying pitch, nor does he think he has the velo to be a starter. But he does give him a chance still to be a nice back end starter. I think the main thing is that he wants to see better command. And I would agree with that. I do think that's something he has to improve on. So that's the two guys he's way lower on. And then Mike Bovey, he has at like 40. He has him at 40, which is really, really low compared to everyone else. But he does give him his issue is that he doesn't think the hit tool is very good. And he actually, now that I'm looking at this again, he is talking a little bit about the velo and he's worried about him being able to hit velo. So, like I just talked about, I think that's a fair thing to be a little concerned about. I just think it might take him a little bit of time to get used to it. So, we will see on that. And then I will say, go read the write-ups. There's a ton of good information. Even if you don't agree with this stuff, anytime a list comes out that gives me a bunch of, I mean, he's got like zone contact rates. He's got some of their max exit velos, their average exit velos, like stuff you don't find other places. So I always encourage people to read the write-ups, even if you don't necessarily agree with the list that they put together. And then MLB Pipeline came out with their top 30. Really no surprises. I don't think they usually stick with the most common thought process in general. I mean, they do good work too, but of all the lists, I might say that I value them the least just because I think that they're also stretched thin, and I think they kind of just go with whatever they hear from scouts and stuff. So I don't think they do much of their own evaluation. Cooper Pratt cracked the top 10, and that might be the only list he cracked the top 10 on. So that might be the one thing of note there, but that was it. And then Prospects Live, who I also really enjoy, also do a lot of their own work without valuing what other people are saying, had their top 100 come out, and they have 7 Brewers, which obviously they included DL Hall as a prospect, like Baseball America, so that helped. But Churio number 3, Wichrowski 40, 44 Quero, 70 Black, 72 Wilkin, 85 Ortiz, and 89 Hall. So that was the second most top 100 guys behind the Padres, who had 8. But yeah, just again, it's a very good system, a lot of really good players, and an exciting time, like we talked about with that breakout game. Definitely watch that, learn about some of these guys, check it out. It's a fun system. It's a team that can compete right now and should be able to compete for a long time. So, Gunnar, why don't you give me your random Brewer?
I brought him up today, so I might as well use him. Mark Rogers, first rounder, thought he'd be part of the Braun, Fielder, Hart, Weeks, Hardy, that sort of group when he was supposed to be. Injuries held him back. He did pop up, I want to say 2012-ish, and it had to be that last month or 2 months. And pitched really well, so I was excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a weird story how he's was able to overcome the injuries, and now he's looking really good again as the guy. I don't know if he was our top prospect, but he was supposed to be. And with the injuries, he was held back. But then I'm like, oh, it's all coming together, and then he got hurt again. I wonder if you noticed this too, Spencer. I know. He after he left us, he signed with the Mariners, and I wonder if you notice how throughout our childhood, guys like Weeks and Hart always signed with the Mariners, and I was able to put it together because their GM was
Yep.
like our draft guy or one of our top draft
Yeah.
guys. And it was ironic that he signed those top picks that we used to have Weeks Hardy, or not Hardy, Weeks Hart, and then Mark Rogers is probably, I bet there's more on the list. I just know those off the top of my head.
Right.
But it was just really funny to think that he just kept getting our scraps because he was the guy who drafted those. So,
Oh yeah, Jack
um,
Zarenchik. Yeah,
yep, that
I
was the
mean
name.
he drafted very well for sure.
Hmm.
Um, no, yeah, Mark Rogers was definitely one of the first. He was actually one of like the first prospects I knew about back in the day because he was hyped up quite a bit, and
Yep.
I think he came up in 2010. Now that I'm seeing it, looks like
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
yeah, 10 innings, 11 strikeouts, only gave up 2 hits. Like he
Did he
pitched
pop
really
up
well
again
in
in
that poster.
2012 though too? I feel like he did pop up in
Yep, he did. He
2012.
had 39
Yeah.
innings then and struck out 41 in those 39. So he did a good job for sure when he got his chance. He just never could stay healthy. Um, yeah, mine is Sean Halton. He, funny enough, I was at like every big career moment he had because I was at the game when he hit his first career homer, and I was at the game when he hit a grand slam, and he only hit 4 homers total in his career. So I was there for everything that he had pretty much. Um, no, I thought honestly, like looking back, I thought he was like 30 when he came up. He was 26. He was drafted in 2009 and made it to the majors in 2013. Like it was a pretty normal climb to the majors. I just
Mhm.
assumed at the time, looking back on it, that he was like some old dude who was getting a shot. Finally, he looked like it. Um,
We had
but
plenty of those, so I
oh
don't
yeah,
blame you.
we did. But I mean, the Grand Slam was cool. I remember it. It was actually kind of a big moment against the
Hmm.
Cubs. And then the first homer, I want to say was against Cincinnati. And yeah, was at both those games. So he was him, Matt Clark, that type of guy in the first base days after Prince Fielder. We
Yep.
were going through it. But yeah, that was my guy. So I think we went long again, Gunner. We were trying to hit a little shorter on this one, and we did not.
It's a little shorter, I think, but
Yeah, we'll see. Um,
like I said, we're gonna be gone for a week, so now you got
that's true. That's true. This
maybe
is like
two
a
episodes
double
in one.
episode. We
Yeah,
did a
exactly.
double episode for you guys. You guys should all be so thankful. Um, for those of you still listening, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod, and please feel free to leave feedback for us on how we can get better. Again, that might just be shut up and stop talking for as long. We don't want to listen for an hour and a half. That's fine. We'll do that. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.
See ya.